All right, hello and welcome to the Story Game Sojourn. My name is Samuel James, and I'm just going to record a simple solo episode for you today. I've titled this An Oral History of Story Games. I titled it that because it's just me talking through a version of what has unfolded and how these story games came about. And it's an oral history of story games, not the oral history of story games. So I'm going to put my own spin on it and recount the events of days past and kind of take us through to the present, highlighting different bits and features of narrative games and how this has come to be. So buckle up, get some popcorn, and put some sriracha on that popcorn. Let's get into it. So I'm going to start with kind of the prehistory of these games, and some of you are familiar with this history, so I won't go for too long, but back in Prussia in 1800s, we have a game called Kriegsspiel, which is a rigid military training tool with very, very detailed rules. And it's a very complex war game in which you have military officers arguing over the exact rules of how things like morale and terrain and weaponry all work. And it was kept in this massive tome. And then up along comes a version in which relies on a referee to use without the strict rules and use more of their judgment, and that is called Free Kriegsspiel, which is more or less collected and released in the 1870s. So it focuses more on realism and speed and the referee's authority. So a commander who has seen battle, who has led troops, is going to be more adept and able to adjudicate a war in a war game scenario than rules. A game of Kriegsspiel would involve different sides of play competing against one another to achieve their objectives, and a referee would adjudicate. They would use their expertise in war to adjudicate the results of what would happen. So this trust the referee philosophy is going to come up later, but it's going to deeply influence RPGs as they emerge here. The next topic I want to hit on is the author H.G. Wells, the Time Machine Man, who published a little set of rules called Little Wars in 1913. These are a set of rules used for toy soldiers. And there are pictures of Wells on the ground with these miniatures on different pieces of terrain and things that he had built. And it kind of emphasized the fun and creativity and house ruling of war games over rigid simulation. So you can allow for some whimsical battles with improvised terrain, and was just kind of an imaginative way of playing a game. So you may have heard of H.G. Wells and his Little Wars, but I was put onto a different set of rules that H.G. Wells created with his two sons that he called the Floor Game. This is in 1909. Just listen as I read out these rules of some of the things they came up with for how to play the game. Father will lay out the toys and say what the game is about. The boys play by taking turns and adding to the story. Listen and don't talk over one another no matter how excited or angry you get. Work together to tell an exciting story. One boy picks up a toy and says what happens. Move the toys around as you speak and make appropriate noises as you go. Animal cries, machine sounds, and conversations between toys and people are all okay. After adding to the story, let your brother have a turn. Your brother may add to or even change your story. And if any boy doesn't like a change, they may ask Father to flip the Queen Victoria penny to see who wins. Don't get cross or knock the game over if your favorite toy gets killed. Say how they are saved. Father can add problems to the game. He may also say no to any addition if it is unfair or will make the boys fight. The boys may shoot marbles at toys whenever they like. If they fall over, they are dead. The game ends when Father says so or when Mother calls us for dinner. First off, I just love these because they're so they're so geared towards the audience of play. So it's written for his boys, and you can it's just dripping with all of these little winks and nods towards how we should behave and how you should let your brother have a turn, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's also a means by which to adjudicate results. So flipping a coin was how they sought to do this. Heads I win, tails you win, etc. So then we get over to Braunstein. We jump all the way to the 1970s, essentially 1969 up to the 70s here, with David Wesley's Braunstein. So we have a Napoleonic war game session that turned players playing individual characters. So this is a scenario that Wesley had devised where players pursue goals that are outside of combat. So things like being a mayor or a revolutionary or a student. And the referee then, Wesley, had to adjudicate unique and unpredictable actions. So interestingly enough, the game is established as kind of a role-playing referee model in which you have open-ended player input and then a referee to judge what happens next. But notably, the game is also not dependent on this relationship, so the game still occurs without referee input. The referee is almost waiting to react and to adjudicate for player behavior. So in one instance, we had two players that were in discussion, and it got heated, and so they wanted their characters to have a duel. And so they came to the referee to adjudicate the duel, and the referee said, okay, well, you're going to roll these dice, you're going to roll these dice, whoever rolls higher wins, and if you roll high enough, the other characters will die. And so that's what happened. So all of the play happened away from the referee, and it's something in which the players then created and drove a lot of the drama that happens. So you may know that history because that's what leads into Dave Arneson creating Blackmore, which then further fed into Gary Gygax creating Dungeons and Dragons, right? And the rest, as they say, is history. Then we move into an interesting part of this story game history that you may not know. This comes to us in 1988, in which a man named Chris Ingle creates a system for wargaming that's subjective, problem-driven, and words-based. So contrast this to your chits on a hex map kind of war games in which you have people simulating Napoleonic Wars and the Civil War and World War I, and you have different pieces moving around and complex scenarios in which you have definite objectives. So this commander needs to capture this spot or remove enemies from XYZ's place. And instead, we have kind of subjective outcomes here. So we have things like a Model UN, if you want to think of it that way, where you have different players representing different points of view and that have their own objectives that may conflict directly with one another or just run in parallel. And it's also problem-driven, so players would be given a faction or a person to represent, and they would be given a perspective on a problem. And the problem is what brings all of these particular players together. And it is also words-based. It's about players proposing arguments about what happens next, supported with reasons, usually on a turn-based basis. So a player who represents the United States may say what they do and then say why they believe such things will succeed. So they list any pros to their argument about why something will happen. And then other players can propose cons. So the matrix in matrix games comes from a table that is used to determine the probability of outcomes. So based on how many arguments you gave and how many strong arguments there were versus how many cons there were, that created a set of outcomes that usually was determined on two six-sided dice, and then it would say what happens next. So it prioritized logic, creativity, and negotiation over fixed mechanics for things like economies, negotiation, and combat. So imagine Axis and Allies, but without all the rules for combat. It would be more about adjudicating reasons why you think such things should happen. Plausibility to determine uncertain outcomes and some dice instead of just what the board game rules may suggest. So it was used in education, in professional settings, and wargame simulations. Again, think kind of a Model UN in which you have people determining the next likely outcomes of a problem based on their inputs and what the different people involved, different peoples and factions and nations involved in that problem would do. So this is, I would consider, kind of a traditional Matrix game, which spins off a whole series of war games and scenario-driven play. Then in the next year, in 1989, Chris Engel comes up with the social matrix game, which is more about words based and problem driven play. So you can see it right from the rules. I'll just read them off. So you start with a problem and then you say what happens next. There is no order of play. Anyone can add to or alter what happens. And then all players may ask a player to roll if they don't like what they said. And you roll 2d6. On a 7 or higher, the action happens and cannot be altered. On a 6 or lower, it does not happen and cannot happen in the game. The game ends when the problem is solved. So unlike your traditional role-playing games, which now kind of move more towards the forever game of you are players, your characters in a place, and you're just going to go and encounter things along the way. Anything could happen. The social matrix game and the matrix game itself are put together and kind of surrounded with a problem without a definite solution, and that creates the boundaries of play. So the game ends when the problem is solved applies to the social matrix game and to the more traditional war game matrix game. So this creates a whole different aspect, a whole different way of looking at role-playing games as a means of scenario design and subjective objectives. So next we have the indie explosion and the narrative mechanics in the early thousands. Things like The Forge and story games as designed by Ron Edwards and household names like Vincent Baker begin to emerge. So we get things like Dogs in the Vineyard, later Apocalypse World, and they explored very story-first rules. So coming at from the kind of traditional role-playing game lens, they then moved to the story first, or what we might call fiction first. So we have mechanics that tie directly to narrative outcomes. And there's a shared narrative authority, less centralized on the referee, perhaps. We also get the popularization of GM-less play through games like Fiasco, Microscope, and The Quiet Year. So some games from this time doubled down on structured mechanics for collaborative storytelling, and others began discovering minimalist, procedure-based approaches. And this is when people start to rediscover things like Moldvay D&D, which leads us to the OSRs. So this is the old school Renaissance, revival, reformation, revolution. It's got this nostalgia for the early Dungeons and Dragons, especially the red box Moldvay, in which you have people that want to preserve the older editions and also the culture of play that comes with it. So they highlight a play culture of procedure, rulings over rules, exploration, and narratives emergent from system play. So a lot of the philosophy that you see around the OSR comes from rulings, not rules, in which the referee is the final arbiter and creates judgments rather than consulting some universal system. And while that is kind of the professed philosophy, I would say even closer down to the foundation is the idea of hygienic procedures. So complex and interconnected systems that simulate a world. This is where we get things like reaction tables. This is where we get the encounter check, what it means to move through a dungeon in turns, what you should do every 6th turn, whether it comes to resting and such. So we have these detailed systems, which are then able to be pointed to as kind of hygienic play. So there's a basis, there's a grounding. The game has kind of a spine. And we use those systems that interact together to create emergent narratives. So create stories that arise naturally from play, not scripted arcs. So instead of having a particular plot that you're going to follow, there is a situation. And then that situation, through different dice results, may result in something completely different than the GM or the referee may have originally intended. Also from the OSR, we get player skill over character skill. So we get a lot around problem solving and creativity and negotiation that matter more than character stats. So the answer is not found on your character sheet is a motto from this time. And then we also have minimalism and DIY. So there's a culture of hacking and house ruling and self-publishing. And then the objective, like Braunstein and the Matrix games, the OSR kind of thrives on this open-ended problem solving. So unlike Matrix games, there is no set, this is what you're be set out to do. The OSR and a lot of those early dungeon crawl games just reward players for obtaining gold and retrieving it from the wilderness. It has no bearing on how you do that or where you go, and it does not make any sort of predetermined determinations. And then kind of some of the differences, I guess, in regards to the previous eras that we've talked about. The indie story games use rules to shape narratives, whereas these prefer to challenge players and let stories emerge naturally. So the OSR kind of has that focus to it. Then let's move into the 2010s to today. We have the free Kriegsspiel revival or renaissance or reformation or revolution, what have you. They can't decide. There are, just like the OSR, and it's kind of a joke. As a modern movement, it's a collection of online communities whose core philosophy is minimal or no rules and referee adjudication. The referee is the rules. So just like we have in the OSR, rulings not rules, in which the referee is has the final say instead of consulting a system. In everything, in an FKR game, the referee is the final say. And so the dice are used sparingly because it is the referee usually that comes up with the logic that drives the outcome. So players say what they do, and then the referee is able to use their brain, the superpower of conversational games and role-playing games, to determine what happens next. And so we get kind of this fiction-first play that we saw in the indie story game movement, and out comes the motto, play worlds, not rules. And so the referee is largely the determinant of what the world is and what the world looks like. But you can have players make a plea to genre conventions and to the rules and the laws of the world as a means by which to accomplish what they want. And that leads us to the modern story game, so kind of in the 2020s up to today. So I was led to the Matrix game by means of Chris McDowell, who is part of the OSR movement, and ran into a book called the Matrix Games Handbook from 2018 by John Curry. This contained a selection of big multiplayer asymmetric games which follow the Matrix games tradition that Chris Engel outlined. And so Chris McDowell read this and created a Matrix game called Sunrise Expansion, in which there are sci-fi factions fighting over Mars and the asteroid belt and Earth and all of that. The players are given a set of faction objectives and assets, and they're given some information and then told you have 6 turns in order to complete your objectives, and given very large reign by which to accomplish those objectives. And there's no winner for these because the objective is so subjective. More or less, the person who runs their faction makes a determination of how well they did. Some just simply saying, yeah, I failed, or I succeeded, or I think I failed, or I think I succeeded, and here's why. So upon hearing about Sunrise Expansion, I created 2 games, one called Landover, which is based on Terry Brooks' fantasy novels, where there is a man who comes to a fantasy world and becomes king, and he actually buys the kingdom. The Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold is the first novel. And there are all sorts of fantasy creatures and factions, a group of horse-riding men, a dragon, a witch, and ogres, and all sorts of things. So the players are all of those factions who then war with one another. And the other game was called The War in Crow's Foot, which takes the factions of Blades in the Dark and sets them on the edge of war. So they are put in a situation and then given 6 turns to declare their actions, and they negotiate with each other in between turns in order to do what they are setting out to accomplish based on their faction. And then we have open strategy games, which is the term that Chris McDowell came up for these kinds of big multiplayer asymmetrics games. You may have heard them is called mega games, right? So a lot of people involved with the scenario in which they're warring or creating friction with one another. So an open strategy game is this particular flavor. If you're familiar with kind of the Sid Meier Civilization or Alpha Centauri, like those kinds of games all fall in here. And more recently, if you've heard of Sam Sorensen's Cataphracts games, it's also in that similar vein of the referee creates a scenario, creates a set of rules that are fairly loose, and then adjudicates the outcomes of player actions that are declared from there. So then in 2023, Chris Engel sent me a copy of a book he published called Social Matrix Games, in which he typed up all the different ways in which one can play a Matrix game. So all of the different genre types, ranging from action to adventure to mystery to science fiction and horror, and then also the different means by which you could play a Matrix game. This includes things like sitting around the table, like a conventional style game, or playing over online and playing with just your voice and maybe a video camera, to playing on play-by-post and those kinds of things. So many means and many mediums by which these kind of narrative games can be constructed. And so since then, since learning more about the modern story game, I've created and played a number of games, including zombie games, a Space Pirates game, a haunted Hogwarts game, and then this very podcast was created as a means by which to continue to play modern story games. Things like Scooby-Doo, Phineas and Ferb, Samurai Jack, Batman, and more. So it fits all sorts of story shapes better than really any role-playing game that I've experienced. And so just to kind of summarize some of the things in this history that we've outlined here, they've emphasized an emergent narrative, an emergent gameplay. So unlike a board game, which may have very strict rules about what can and can't happen, and they are the final arbiter for what can occur, we have things that emerge from fiction, emerge from the gameplay and the scenario that we've outlined. And they all kind of descend in some way from the referee and their imagination model. So seated by, when we talked about H.G. Wells and Braunstein and free Kriegsspiel, all of those kinds of things that work together to create the modern story game. And so the rules of today kind of follow like this, that first we start with a scenario, and then we say what happens next. There is no turn order. Build on each other's ideas. If there's uncertainty, we roll dice, and the host can veto at any time. So we end when the scenario is then resolved. So from these, we can kind of see the through line from all of these eras that we've touched on. So the free Kriegsspiel in the early days pioneered referee-led judgments over rigid rules. So instead of consulting the rule book, we will consult a person with a brain to adjudicate what happens. And then H.G. Wells introduced this playfulness and improvisation into war games with his two sons. Braunstein birthed open-ended role play with individual characters and asymmetric play. So characters are given different kind of objectives here. Traditional Matrix games emphasize narrative logic and arguments. So the means by which you can resolve a situation in a Matrix game can be to appeal to the logic of the world and appeal to fellow players and the referee in order to strengthen the outcome. Then we have indie story games, which build kind of the fiction-first mentality that fuels narrative games. We're going to start with The World, and they introduce games that divide the powers of responsibilities of the referee among players. So this is something that we see especially in the modern story game. The OSR reestablished that DIY ethic of old and the emphasis on input tools like tables and procedures in order to create that emergent storytelling. And then the FKR circled back to trusting in the referee roots and emphasizing the law of the world as the foundation for play. So this is just to kind of emphasize from the beginning of this storytelling thing and what we've been doing here. And I just hope it kind of illustrates the background and the canvas on which we're painting here. This didn't just appear out of nowhere. A large amount of credit is due to the creators of the Free Kriegsspiel, H.G. Wells, David Wesley, Chris Engel, all of these thinkers who have created something that is incredible and that we are kind of playing out live now. So if you want to hear more about this and kind of read about Matrix games, story games, and such, there is this Substack, which I will put a link to, of the Story Games Sojourn. And then there is also the Dreaming Dragon Slayer blog that I write for, which has more of a tabletop adventure games bent to it. So thanks for tuning in, and until then, I'm Samuel James, and I hope you have an awesome day.